Hello. First, I'm going to explain the difference between class variables and instance variables. So here, in my class employee, I have declared 5 variables. The first 4 are instance variables, meaning that they are unique to each object. Every object has its own copy of the instance variables, and it's going to get initialized with possibly different values. This is the class variable. Also, you can call it a static variable, and it's the counter for how many objects of the class have been created. So every time one of the constructors is called, the count is going to increment by 1. And this count variable has the same value for every object of the class. It's not dependent on the instance. And that's the difference between them. The reason we have getters and setters for this class is because the variables are private. So to access the variables outside of the class, you need to have getters and setter methods. So having getters and setters helps you control how the data is handled. So these private variables can't be accessed directly from outside of the function. So you get to decide what can and can't be accessed outside of the class. Some variables could be read only, or like you can only get them and you can't set them, or some of them you can only set but you can't get. It's also good for flexibility because if I wanted to change something here, like the way the data is stored, I don't have to change it everywhere else in the code. I just have to fix the getters and setters that correspond with them. So as you can see here, there's a pointer to an employee called boss declared inside of each instance of employee. And it has to be declared as a pointer because if not, it would create an infinite loop. Um, when one object of employee is created, if this didn't have the pointer symbol there, it would create another employee called boss. And then when that boss employee is created, it is going to create another employee, and it's just going to do that forever. But if we just put a pointer, that solves the problem. The static variable from the employee class, which keeps track of the count of the number of employees, has to be initialized outside of the class. And this is because since all instances share that variable, there needs to be one place for them all to access it. This way, there's only one memory allocation for count. Okay, now I'm going to show you how my code runs. So it's asking for the name of the first employee, and it shows that there should be a space in between the first and the last name. I'm going to put a name, and then the address with a comma between city and state. Now the next employee need another name and their address. And then the third employee. So now, after you put in the 3 employees, first it displays the count, that static variable, and 3 is what we expected, so that's good. I'm listing the first name, last name, city, and state all separately to show that each of these strings were successfully broken up. And all of them look right. And you'll notice that the boss of the second employee is the first employee, and the boss of the third employee is the second employee. Okay, so starting from the top, I've declared a function prototype that I'm going to use later in the main function. The first class is address. It has 2 private variables. So each of those variables has its own getter and setter method. So it can be accessed outside of the class. It has one constructor that takes in a string city and string state and sets them to their, sets them equal to city and state. So There's a display method in address that will be called from employee when employee information needs to be displayed. And there's a static method here, grab address. It's static because it is independent from any one instance of the class. So it takes an address on a single line, and it splits it up into city and state, which is separated by a comma, and it creates two substrings and then puts them into an array with two elements. So when they're split up, they can be put into the address constructor later. The employee class also has private variables. The first four are instance variables, and the last one is a static variable. So the first four each have a getter and a setter method, but the static one only has a getter method. It's not meant to be manipulated. It should only increment whenever the constructor is called. So we have four constructors. The first one takes no arguments. All it does is increment the count, and it just gives each of the variables their default values up here. The second one takes the first name and the last name and calls the first constructor right here. So that means the count's going to increment when this constructor is called, and then the name is going to be set to the values that were passed in. Here, the name, last name, and boss is passed in, and it's going to call the second constructor. So when it calls this constructor, it's going to assign the name and the last name with the the arguments that were passed in. And then it's going to set this boss equal to the boss that was passed into the function. This is like the new thing, so that's why it goes in the body of this one, and everything else is called from the cascading ones before. And then the last one takes name, last name, boss, and address and calls the third constructor. So we don't have to write this code over and over again every time. We don't have to write a count increment every single time in each of these bodies, because we can just call the function before and it'll just go all the way through and initialize everything. So the new one for this one is that it'll set the address to the address that was passed in. There's a display function here. It always displays the first name and the last name. It will only display the boss and the address if it is applicable, if it isn't a null pointer. The address class has its own display function, so that's going to be called from within the display employee function. And then this static method is very similar to the one in the address class. It takes in a name as one line with a first and last name separated by a space, and then it splits it up into first and last name so that it can be put into a constructor later, and it returns an array with the first name and last name as elements. So here is where the count is initialized outside of the class, which I explained earlier. And then here's the main function. So I've declared input strings for the name and the address, and then pointers for the name and the address that are going to be passed in to the constructor. So for the first employee, I have called this function, which I made so that to reduce like redundancy in this main part. So if we look down here, it takes in all the variables I declared in main, and it gets the input. I had to use getLine so that the space doesn't mess it up. You can have spaces in it. So it asks for the employee name, and it just takes it and stores it in name input, which all of these I passed in by reference so that they can all be manipulated. That's why the return type is void, because all the data is being manipulated within the function, so I don't need anything to be returned. There's no copies being made. These ones are a little different because they're pointers, so the asterisk is there to show that we are changing what it's pointing to. So then we also need to call grab name and grab address to get the arrays with the string inputs split up. So there's grab name and grab address, which we looked at earlier. So that function's called, it gets the input, and then it splits it up into first name, last name, city, state. And then I created the first employee using the default constructor, so no arguments were put in. And then I set the first name and the last name and the address using the setters that I defined in the class. Employee 2 was called the second instructor, so this time the names, the first name and last name was put in using the array that's returned from grab name. And the boss is set to employee 1. So this one has a boss. Employee 1 does not have a boss. It's still a null pointer. So when I print it later, no boss will show up. And then the address is the same thing for this one. We have to create a new address with the values that we got from our array. And then employee 3 uses the third constructor. So we're putting in the name and the boss. So the boss of employee 3 is employee 2. And we set the address the same way as the other ones. And then at the end, I show the count first. So here is where I'm getting the count from employee using the getter method. And then I just call the display function for each of the employees. And that's the end. Something to note here, like if you compare these two, is both of these functions take in the address of the object. So I'm passing in the address of an employee object into setBoss, and I'm passing in the address of an address object into this function. And the return type of new is the memory location, so that's why it works out.